Okay, sticking with the VFX theme, another very commonly used thing in VFX is UV distortion. So we have here what looks kind of like a watery effect, maybe looking through water, that kind of distorted underwater look. And it's actually very simple. All we're doing is using one texture to distort another. And so if I start here at the top, here we have our UV coordinates. We plug them in. We have our grayscale checkerboard as a nice debug texture, and then I have some noise. If I add my noise to my UVs, I get loads and loads of distortion. It's completely unrecognizable, apart from maybe the colors. So what's happening is, well, here the values are between 0 and 1, and then we've added more values between 0 and 1. We've ended up with a lot of distortion. If we scale that down, let's just connect this to emissive, by multiplying our distortion texture, we can control how much distortion is happening. So in this case, if I do a little bit, 0.1, well, even that's quite a lot, 0.01, 0.05, 0.02, something like that. 2% of this texture is added to our UVs. They're very sensitive. Now we get that distortion happening. And you might notice if we have, 0.05, quite a lot of distortion. The texture is being moved up and left. Remember, that's where 0 is. So by adding values, we're moving things towards 0. And so because of that, quite often when we're doing distortion, we use a normal map. Normal map has values that are both positive and negative. It's been unpacked. And so now when I add that, make that my distortion texture, what we get is an equal amount of textures moving left as right, as up, as down, and we get our sort of texture appearing to be centered. No matter how much distortion we add, it's all kind of staying in place. Obviously we could do this manually up here. We just subtract 0.5 from our texture first. A bit like we did when we had to scale the UVs to the center. That will now be sort of centered just using this texture. So up to you. Convenience wise, it's maybe a bit more convenient to use a normal map. And as also, as we've mentioned before, normal maps have a higher compression ratio. And so it's only compressing the red and green channels and then deriving the blue. And so because of that, you get more accuracy. And as we see, the textures or the distortion is very sensitive, so more accuracy, more texture information is a good thing. Simple animation on our distortion texture, and suddenly we have this motion, this movement. Obviously we can take this further and combine multiple animated textures. If we do different textures moving at different speeds, and let's say slightly faster. I'm just going to add these together. And we can get even more kind of distortion and movement to that. So very common VFX technique to take two textures, scrolling at different speeds, and add them together or combine them in some way, and give us the illusion of lots of motion and movement. And it's a very powerful effect. Just lay that down a little bit. Yeah, something we do all the time, or just a little bit of distortion affecting our UVs. One thing to note, it isn't the cheapest thing in the world. Everything that we're doing that's affecting a texture before a sample, so anything this side of a texture sample, can get quite expensive because we're having to calculate that per pixel of this texture. So that said, it is a powerful technique and we do use it all the time. Just be aware that it's not necessarily the cheapest technique compared to, say, just using a flipbook for animation. But there's pros and cons of all these things. Open my Fire UV. So you can make fire completely out of UV distortion. It works very well for stylized fire, and we might have a look at that in a future tutorial. But there is definite costs associated with it versus just using a flipbook. So pros and cons to both techniques, but very useful for adding a little bit of distortion to our things.